although Koen called it a post-Cajun piece of music because there's a lot of space in terms of silence, and there's a lot of influence by the performers themselves, as opposed to the influence of chants and voice of John Cage's pieces. But Cage did use the element of a score as opposed to musical notation, and I can read here something about the use of the score, and that is also the way George Brecht, amongst many others, but also Dick Higgins, how they worked with scores. So in Flux's word scores, the usual ties that performance mark established between composer, score, musician, instrument, and musical sound are arbitrary and may indeed be broken for the purposes of composition. The composer nearly disappears altogether in a Brecht word score, like many in the collection Water Jam, because the introductions are so non-specific that a performer has complete latitude in interpretation. This is what is said about typical Fluxus scores. You could say that this score is less typical Fluxus, because there's not so much, I think, dependent here. But we have to see or to find out in which way this performance here is like the kind of scores this text is about. So in Flux's word scores, the usual ties that performance marks established between composer, score, musician, instrument, and musical sound are arbitrary and may indeed be broken for the purpose of composition. For a work to be truly impossible, it must be impossible to realize in a phenomenal sense. The instructions must elude even the most hypothetically dedicated and suicidal performer, or have some essential element that makes the realization of the music truly impossible, as with some works in the historical tradition of conceptual music by such notables as Guillaume Apollinaire, Marcel Duchamp, and Raymond Roussel. If the realizable Fluxus word-scored events find in their short form the side gags of vaudeville, the films of Buster Keaton, and the early television of Spike Jones and Ernie Kovacs, the impossible scores find their gags in the impossible physics and physiologies of animated cartoons, which are rife with their own history of new and conceptual instruments. Many activities are named music in Flux's word scores. This impulse might well derive from certain categorical conceits of Western art music itself. There is the idea, for instance, that music, because the character of musical signification is to lack specificity, is a proper name for things that cannot be readily named. The inability to be articulate in any of its forms is thus valorized as the civilizing and sublime practice of music in Fluxus performance. The latest aesthetic of Western art music, the Cajun enterprise, provided further rationale for subsuming a range of activities under the rubric of music. If all sounds can be musical sounds, then this fruitful premise might be transferred readily from the realm of audible or potentially audible sounds to any realm or whatsoever. I was referring to a text by Dick Higgins. It is called In a Minesweeper Around the World, Some Remarks on Fluxus. One part of the origin of Fluxus was the classes in experimental composition, which John Cage taught at the New School for Social Research in New York City in the late 50s. George Brecht, Jackson McLough, Paul Hansen, myself and various others took these classes, and we were expected to bring in a new composition of some kind for more or less every class. The only instruments in the classroom area were a grand piano, a collection of Oriental instruments used for Henry Cowell's class in Music of the World's Peoples, and, as they accumulated, a large number of toys, which we bought over a period of time to try our pieces out. Other than that, there was only whatever we happened to have in our pockets, comps, coins, and such like. In a situation like that, one couldn't very well write for string quartets or small orchestras. Thus, from the beginning, that class was oriented towards unconventional means of making art out of sounds. One aspect of Cage's attitude was shown by one of his first questions. Is there anyone here who has never before composed any music? Several hands went up. Is there any one of you who cannot read music? Al Hansen's hand went up. Good, said Cage to Hansen. You at least have nothing to unlearn. The details of Cage's class are pretty well known, from Richard Kostelanich, John Cage, available in Germany and the USA. I won't repeat that story. Basically, he emphasized the notation, the process of realizing the notation, the implications of the entire process, and he de-emphasized most craftsmanly elements of composition. It was largely stripped down to aesthetics. After the series of classes got underway, many of his students found that the little pieces we were making for his classes were not just classroom exercises to us, but were fully satisfying. So we made a good relationship with some places in the neighborhood, such as the Epitome Coffee Shop, and we tried out our pieces on the public there, often performing under the name of the New York Audiovisual Group. Cage himself never made any pieces which resembled Fluxus pieces. For him, our compositions were, I think, not very satisfying. Nor did we necessarily accept all his teachings, for example, his mistrust of expression or of mimesis of all kinds. His role was more like an uncle and godfather to us than of a father. Happenings were in the air then in New York, America and Europe, more or less independently. Artists around the world were beginning to do open-form performances which had little, if anything, to do with traditional theater. But most happenings, artists worked out of art galleries and later museums. With us, on the other hand, one of our problems was that our own performances, which tended to come out of music, dance and literature rather than from the visual arts, did not fit into gallery or museum programs. We performed, therefore, in theaters and cafes for the most part. And this meant that there was rather little unity in what we did. There would be a series of informal concerts at Yoko Ono's loft, a concert at a college or a theater, and there was no sense of continuity. We needed a rostrum. One of us, the electronic composer Richard Maxfield, became friendly at this time, 1960, with a young Lithuanian radical, George Maciunas, who had a gallery on Madison Avenue. He persuaded him to start a series of performances there of our work and of work by Lamont Young and his circle, who had recently arrived in New York from San Francisco. Young had been asked to guest edit a special issue of a magazine, Beatitude East, to consist of the new kind of work which we were doing. Young collected the material, a vast amount of it, but the magazine collapsed before it was published. So Young and McLeod brought the material to Matthieunis, and in due course it appeared as a book, an anthology, which was the first Fluxus-type publication. However, Matthieunis had to close his gallery and went to Europe to avoid his creditors, taking many materials with him which had not found space in an anthology. His idea was to issue a magazine of such materials to be called Fluxus. In Europe, he met others who were doing similar work: Emmett Williams, Namjoon Pike, Wolf Vastel, Benjamin Patterson, and others. Through Ayo, a Japanese artist who lived in New York at that time, Matthieunis also learned of and obtained similar materials from Japan by people such as Takehisa Kosugi, Chiko Shiomi, and a concert of Neo-Dada in der Musik was presented at Düsseldorf. It was us, but it was ill-named, because there was really little in common between what we were doing and Dada. By the summer of 1962, the Fluxus magazine was well underway, and Matthieunis wanted to present a large festival of Fluxus pieces. The Düsseldorf critic Jean-Pierre Wilhelm arranged with the museum at Wiesbaden to work there. Alison Knowles and myself came to Europe from America to help Matthieunis. The concerts created a great scandal and much serious interest, and so in the autumn of 1962 Fluxus became Fluxus, and the press decided to call us the Fluxus-Leute. It was an interesting time. One Fluxus concert was broadcast on television on the news, and Matthieunis, poor old mother who lived with us outside Wiesbaden and who had no idea what we were up to, stayed indoors for about 2 weeks afterwards because she was ashamed to meet the neighbors. And for us, we stayed up most nights arguing and discussing what Fluxus was, what we had in common and what we did not have in common, and we were issued a manifesto. But we did work out a theoretical position for ourselves, which was basically a hermeneutic one and which has been written about elsewhere, so I won't go into that in any detail. The Wiesbaden Festival was followed by festivals at Copenhagen, Paris, Düsseldorf and Stockholm, with other allied performances happening in between, such as one in connection with a show of Vastel's work at Amsterdam, and another, the Misfits show in London, both in October 1962. At the Amsterdam performance, the Provost put in their first appearance and built a bonfire outside the gallery out of the debris left over from Patterson's paper piece. Among those provosts was Willem de Ridder, who later organized a Dutch Fluxus festival and who even ran a Fluxus shop in Amsterdam. A very young artist who was there was Thomas Schmidt, who joined us and did some notable pieces. For those who missed it yesterday, Zyklus was performed here by Sara, who's now still throwing the coins. The Misfit show included Daniel Spurri, Arthur Kupke, Robert Vlieu, Emmett Williams, Robin Page and Ben Vautier. Williams was already working with us and the others joined in as well. We did a performance at the Old Institute of Contemporary Arts on Dover Street, which thoroughly shocked the Londoners, gentle as it was, and turned off Britain to Fluxus for another 10 years, frightfully English to react that way. At Düsseldorf we were joined by Joseph Beuys and by some Swedes, Stefan Olsson and Bengt af Klintenberg, who invited us to Sweden, but warned us that there would be very little money. Knowles and I were the only ones who went. Matthieunis was furious and insisted this could not be a Fluxus festival without the whole group, and this offended the Swedes so much that they never worked with Matthieunis afterwards, preferring to stay home in Sweden and Scandinavia in general for their Fluxus activities. When Knowles and I returned to the USA in March 1963, we found that George Brecht and Robert Watts were organizing a Fluxus-type festival under the name of the Jam Festival, named after Jam, a collage by Watts, which Brecht particularly liked. The festival included more than just Fluxus-type pieces. There were memorable dances by Tricia Brown and Yvonne Reiner, a happening by Alan Campos, etc. Wolf Ostel visited America and did a memorable small piece in which he gave a funeral for a television set. Seamus offered to publish my complete works. I told him that would not work, as I had written too much, but that we could make a book of a year's worth of works. The 13th of April 1962 to 13th of April 1963, when I had written a piece I was particularly happy with. The 13th of April happens to be the birthday of Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the USA, and the author of our Declaration of Independence, a great radical. So that project became Jefferson's birthday. He also wanted me to write an account of the background of Fluxus and some of his ideas. This account was intended as a postface to the book, but it became long enough to be an independent work, so it was titled Postface, and was eventually published in one binding with Jefferson's birthday, Theory and Practice in one binding. However, when the manuscript was complete, McMahon kept postponing publishing it. Time passed, McMahon rented a space downstairs from my studio, more time passed. One day I went to him and asked when my book would be ready. He said, a year from next spring. I said it was too long to wait, but he argued that it couldn't be helped. I went downstairs to the bar on the street, thought and had a few drinks, then went back upstairs, removed my manuscript from McMahon's desk and took it upstairs to my own. I had a few more drinks, then went home to Alison Knowles. Alison, I announced, we've found a press. Really, she answered. What is it called? Shirt Sleeves Press. That's no good, she said. Why don't you call it something else? I thought that over and decided she had an excellent name there. I would call it Something Else Press, and would publish only something else from whatever the fashionable publishers were doing. I also liked the implication that something else has an exclamation in English, especially among the black and young people, meaning very good. So the next day I wrote a Something Else manifesto, something which McMahon, for very complex ideological reasons, opposed doing with Fluxus, and in the next 10 years published many of the main texts of happenings, Fluxus, concrete poetry, works of the avant-garde of the past, and other related materials. Something Else Press published 97 books and pamphlets in all before it went bankrupt in 1974, the year after I left it. As for McMahon, he was annoyed with me for starting my own operation. However, his own operation was towards designerly publications, fine small handcraft editions, which could not reach a large public. I took it as my mission to do what I could to break out of this charmed circle of avant-garde specialists. With one book, Emmett Williams' Anthology of Concrete Poetry, we actually sold 18,000 copies, not bad for a press which never ever had more people working for it than one could fit into a taxi. People continued to join Fluxus. Geoffrey Hendricks, P.P. Forbes, and Ken Friedman in the mid-60s. Fluxus continued to evolve as Fluxus. Very name said it should. A flux is either diarrhea, change, or a catalytic moment, all of which pleased Matthieunis when he selected the name. Matthieunis had a dream of, one day, all the Fluxus people boarding a minesweeper, a kind of boat which someone had told him could be bought as surplus from the American Navy, and spending 2 years or so touring the world performing. He also became interested in buying an island in the Caribbean and hoped to gather a group of Fluxus artists together to settle there. He actually went there with a few Fluxus people. However, there turned out to be no water, and there were many poisonous plants, one of which gave off some kinds of fumes which made everyone quite ill. So that plan was abandoned. Instead, he bought an enormous estate in New Marlborough, Massachusetts. Hey, there's a connection between Matthieunis and Massachusetts. About 200 kilometers northeast of New York. It had belonged to some wealthy people who bred horses and only used it in the summers. Therefore, in the winter it was incredibly expensive to heat, and some rooms could not be heated at all. However, he moved there, and the program or tradition of Fluxus feasts and private celebrations, which had become his pattern in the late 1960s in New York, followed him to New Marlborough in the mid-70s. He and we continued to be active. By now, performance art had become popular, with its great, usually unacknowledged depth to Fluxus. In New York, the most interesting series of such works was organized by Jean Dupuis, a French artist who settled there in the late 60s. Dupuis' performances were a little like the Fluxus festivals, in that they included many different people on the program, working in as many divergent new styles as possible. He did one especially fine series, the Grommet Theatre Evenings. A grommet is a small metal ring which is inserted into such materials as canvas when one makes tents, so that rope can be passed through without tearing it. Dupuis hung canvas all around his loft, put grommets into it, and behind each grommet there was a Fluxus or performance art performance, which only one spectator at a time could see. Matthieunis did his last public performance on this occasion, but where the other performances were looked at, Matthieunis did the looking himself. And when anyone came near to his grommet, he would squirt out perfume at them. Dupuis' relation with Fluxus was problematic. We certainly considered him one of us, but was it too late to join in the late 70s? Perhaps he was the last Fluxus artist, at least the last to join during Matthieunis' lifetime. The feasts continued on New Year's Eve, or at Halloween especially. We gave one memorable feast in honor of Matthieunis, and it was held in the printing plant of Jacker Offset, a printer for whom I had worked in the early 60s, and which had become Matthieunis' principal printer. For the occasion, we made up an enormous festschrift for Matthieunis, with pages by as many Fluxus artists as possible. He was very pleased by his event, and he felt good about it. It was well that we did, because by the fall of 1978 it was quite clear that something was seriously wrong. Matthieunis' health, never the best, had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. It developed that a cancer had spread through his body, and that he was doomed. He made the best of it, gave one more spectacular Halloween feast at New Marlborough, and did his best to get his health back. At New Marlborough he had taken as a tenant a young novelist, Billy Hutchings, who seemed to have no idea what Fluxus was, but who loved Matthieunis and was willing to go along with whatever he wanted. They were married in January 1979. The Fluxus artists, who were in New York at the time, did performances at the wedding. Hendricks was the priest, and the bride and groom cross-dressed, as did many of those present. I could could bring up the gay joke again, but fuck it. The wedding was followed by an erotic feast at which Young made an aphrodisiac tonic. I contributed an absolutely tasteless gelatine confection. The texture was interesting though. Someone else baked a huge loaf of bread in the form of genitals, and so on. In other words, the tune is iconoclasm to the end.